James Brown lifted the microphone and called Michael Jackson's name. Michael was standing only a few feet away, dressed in white and silver, watching the man he'd studied since he was 6 years old move across the BET Awards stage. Then Brown added 3 words that changed the feeling of the moment. "For me, my son." The audience saw 2 giants of popular music standing together. The Godfather of soul, the King of pop. 2 men whose movements, cries, spins, and sudden bursts of rhythm had helped reshape what a live performer could do. But Michael didn't look like a rival standing beside another legend. He looked like a student who had finally heard his teacher claim him. That's what made the moment so powerful. Michael had spent decades telling anyone who asked that James Brown was his greatest inspiration. He'd studied Brown through a television screen as a child. In 1983, Brown had called him from an audience and handed him a place on his own stage. 20 years later, Michael returned to honor him, and James Brown answered by calling him his son. If you believe Michael Jackson's musical history deserves to be remembered through verified performances and his own words, please like this video and subscribe. Because the meaning of that word began long before the BET Awards, when a young Michael first saw James Brown move. If you want Michael Jackson's musical story remembered through verified performances, first-hand words, and the artists who shaped him, please like this video and subscribe. Because James Brown didn't call Michael toward him only once. 20 years before that BET moment, he had already spoken Michael's name into a microphone and invited him onto his stage. Those 2 calls carried completely different meanings. In 1983, James Brown called Michael out of the audience at the Beverly Theater in Los Angeles. Michael was already becoming one of the biggest stars in music, but in that room, he was still the younger performer stepping onto his idol's stage. 20 years later, the direction had reversed. At the BET Awards, Michael was the one holding the honor. He had come to thank James Brown publicly, to place Brown's name at the center of his own story, and to make sure the audience understood where so much of his stage language had begun. Then Brown took the microphone back and called Michael his son. By the end of this story, you'll understand why that word meant more than affection between 2 famous entertainers. It connected a child studying television, a young superstar answering an unexpected stage invitation, and a grown artist returning to honor the man who had pointed him toward performance in the first place. This isn't a story about Michael copying James Brown. It's about influence becoming inheritance. And to understand that inheritance, we have to go back before the awards, before Thriller, and before the world knew Michael Jackson's name, to a small boy watching James Brown move across a television screen. Long before James Brown knew Michael Jackson's name, Michael knew James Brown as the man on the television screen. Years later, Michael remembered being about 6 years old when his mother would call him whenever Brown appeared. It didn't matter what time it was or whether Michael had been asleep. When James Brown was performing, she wanted her son to see what was happening. Michael watched closely. He later described Brown as a master at work and said the movement mesmerized him. He had never seen anyone perform that way before. In Michael's own memory, that was the moment he understood what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. We don't know which exact broadcast Michael first meant, and we shouldn't invent the room, the song, or the conversation around it. What matters is what he remembered carrying away. Brown didn't simply dance to the rhythm. His body seemed to become part of it. A sharp movement of the foot could answer the drums. A sudden stop could hold the audience tighter than constant motion. A cry into the microphone could signal the band, raise the pressure, and make the next burst of movement feel even larger. For a child already growing up around music, that was more than entertainment. It was instruction. Michael wasn't watching a performer who made the stage look easy. He was watching someone command every second of it. The sound, the silence, the musicians, and the crowd waiting for the next move. The microphone was still far away then. James Brown wasn't speaking Michael's name or inviting him forward. He didn't know that one of the children watching from home would carry those lessons into Motown, music videos, and stadiums around the world. But Michael never forgot where that first direction came from. And what held him wasn't one famous step. It was the way James Brown could make an entire room move before he moved at all. What Michael studied wasn't one dance step. It was control. James Brown could enter a stage at full speed, cut his body into the rhythm, then stop so sharply that the stillness felt louder than the band. His feet might move first, but his shoulders, hands, voice, and timing all seemed connected to the same beat. Michael noticed that. Brown didn't simply sing while dancers moved around him. His body functioned like another instrument. A cry into the microphone could strike like percussion. A turn could answer the horn section. A pause could hold the crowd in place until he decided to release them. That was the deeper lesson. Movement mattered, but so did the second before it. Brown understood how to make an audience lean forward. He could build tension by withholding the next step, then break it with a burst of speed. He didn't wait for the band to lead him. He appeared to command the music from inside it. Michael carried that understanding into his own work. Years later, audiences would see him hold perfectly still beneath a spotlight, while thousands screamed, waiting for the smallest movement of his hand. They'd watch him use a spin, a sharp vocal sound, or a sudden pause not as decoration, but as part of the arrangement itself. The resemblance to Brown was never something Michael tried to hide. He kept naming him. He called him his greatest inspiration. He spoke about watching him as a child. He returned again and again to the memory of seeing a performer whose speed, showmanship, and authority made the stage feel larger than the room containing it. But influence isn't the same as imitation. Michael wasn't trying to become James Brown. He was learning what total commitment looked like, how rhythm could pass through the voice and into the body, and how one performer could control the emotional timing of an entire audience. For years, those lessons traveled in only one direction. Michael watched. Michael studied. Michael remembered. Then, in 1983, James Brown looked into his own audience, lifted the microphone, and finally called the student forward. Before we enter that theater, one misunderstanding needs to be cleared away. People sometimes reduce Michael's connection to James Brown to a simple accusation: Michael copied him. The resemblance is easy to see: the quick feet, the spins, the sharp vocal cries, the sudden freezes that made the next movement feel even bigger. Michael never denied those roots. He spoke about Brown with open gratitude and repeatedly named him as his greatest inspiration. But Michael's performance language didn't come from one man alone. He also studied Fred Astaire's elegance, Gene Kelly's physical strength, Jackie Wilson's electricity, Motown choreography, mime, and the street dancers whose movements helped reshape modern pop performance. What made Michael original wasn't pretending he had no influences. It was what he did with them. He took Brown's rhythmic force and placed it inside songs built for pop radio. He adapted precise footwork for television cameras that could turn one movement into a close-up seen around the world. Later, he expanded those ideas into short films, major tours, and stadium productions, where even the smallest pause had to reach the last row. James Brown gave Michael part of the foundation. Michael built his own house on top of it, and Brown appeared to understand the difference. He didn't treat Michael like a thief stealing from his legacy. He made room for him. He watched what the younger performer had become and publicly drew him closer. That recognition became impossible to miss on August 20th, 1983. James Brown was performing at the Beverly Theater in Los Angeles when he looked into the audience, raised the microphone, and called for Michael Jackson. On August 20th, 1983, James Brown was performing at the Beverly Theater in Hollywood when he learned that Michael Jackson was in the audience. Michael didn't arrive as part of the advertised show. There was no planned duet, no rehearsed camera position, and no carefully timed entrance. He had come to watch the man whose performances had shaped his understanding of the stage since childhood. By then, Michael was no longer simply the gifted boy from the Jackson 5. Thriller had been released. Billie Jean and Beat It had already reached #1. Only months earlier, millions had watched him perform the moonwalk during Motown 25. Michael was becoming the most talked-about performer in popular music. But inside the Beverly Theater, the hierarchy still felt different. This was James Brown's room, his band, his microphone, his audience. Brown stood beneath the stage lights performing "It's a Man's World," controlling the musicians and crowd with the same authority Michael had studied through a television screen years earlier. Then Brown interrupted the normal flow of his own concert. He spoke Michael Jackson's name. The crowd reacted immediately. Michael had been watching from a seat, but now every face in the theater began turning toward him. The distance between audience and stage, the distance that had once separated a 6-year-old child from the performer on television, was suddenly disappearing. Michael made his way forward. There was something almost ceremonial about it, even though the invitation was spontaneous. The idol wasn't merely acknowledging that another celebrity happened to be present. He was opening his stage, and Michael approached it without the machinery that usually surrounded a major appearance. No dancers, no special lighting, no costume prepared for the number, only James Brown waiting beneath the lights, and one microphone ready to be passed. Michael had spent years studying what Brown could do with that space. Now Brown was stepping aside just enough to see what the student would do with it. Michael stepped onto the stage without asking James Brown's band to become his own. That restraint mattered. He took the microphone and sang only a few phrases, letting his voice settle into the groove, already moving through the theater. Then he stepped away from the stand and allowed his body to answer the music. A turn, a spin, a brief backward glide. The appearance was short, but Michael didn't need a complete song to change the room. He understood how to enter another performer's concert without overwhelming it, and how to leave an unmistakable mark before stepping back. Some of the movement carried the influence everyone could see. The sharpness, the quick feet, the sudden stop after motion. Michael was standing only a few feet from the man who had helped teach him, through television and memory, how rhythm could pass through the entire body. But he didn't look like a child attempting an imitation. The timing belonged to Michael. So did the restraint. He didn't try to defeat James Brown on his own stage or turn the invitation into a contest. When the brief performance ended, Michael moved toward Brown and embraced him. Then he leaned close and whispered into his ear. Brown turned back toward the audience and explained that Michael had insisted he introduce another artist sitting somewhere inside the theater. Prince. That decision changed the clip's public history. The night would later be remembered as the rare moment when James Brown, Michael Jackson, and Prince appeared on the same stage. But Michael's reason for bringing Prince forward has often been buried beneath later stories about competition and rivalry. What the surviving footage clearly shows is simpler. Michael used part of his unexpected moment to point Brown toward another young artist in the room. The microphone had passed from the idol to the student, and before Michael left the stage, he helped direct it toward someone else. Yet for Michael, the most personal part of that night had already happened. James Brown, the man he had studied before Brown even knew his name, had watched him perform from only a few feet away. For years, Michael had watched James Brown without knowing whether Brown would ever notice him. He'd studied the footwork through a television screen, memorized the stops, the turns, and the way Brown could make a room hold its breath. Now the distance was gone. James Brown stood only a few feet away, watching Michael use lessons that had once traveled in just one direction. The child had watched the master. Now the master was watching what the child had become. And 20 years later, the stage would bring them together again. But this time, Michael would be the one holding the honor. 20 years later, the direction of that invitation had reversed. On June 24, 2003, James Brown stood on the stage of the Kodak Theater in Los Angeles to receive BET's Lifetime Achievement Award. This time, Michael Jackson wasn't waiting in the audience for Brown to notice him. He had come to honor him. The setting was larger and more formal than the Beverly Theater had been. Television cameras covered the stage. The award was prepared. Brown's influence was being celebrated before an audience that included artists whose careers had grown from the musical world he helped create. Then Michael appeared. For a performer who had spent decades standing at the center of major productions, he seemed unusually moved by the responsibility in front of him. He wasn't there to promote a record, perform a new single, or remind the audience of his own achievements. He was there to place James Brown's name at the center. That reversal carried its own emotional weight. In 1983, Brown had opened his concert and handed Michael a few moments beneath his lights. In 2003, Michael was helping the industry formally recognize Brown's lifetime of work. Yet Brown didn't enter the moment like a figure from the distant past. He still carried the restless energy Michael had watched as a boy. The The feet still searched for the rhythm. The body still answered the band. Even beneath the ceremonial cape, James Brown remained a performer. Michael stayed close. He helped with the cape routine. He watched Brown move. And for a few seconds, the awards presentation felt less like a formal tribute and more like an old lesson continuing in public. The student was no longer watching through a television screen. He was standing beside the teacher. Then Michael took the microphone and explained, in his own words, why he had never stopped looking up to him. Michael held the microphone, looked toward James Brown, and spoke with none of the distance usually found in an awards show tribute. "Nobody has influenced me more than this man right here." The sentence was brief, but it carried Michael's entire history with Brown inside it. He wasn't offering the kind of praise celebrities exchange because a ceremony expects it. Michael had been telling the same essential story for years. Before the records, the stadiums, and the television performances people would later study, in the same way he had studied Brown, there had been a child watching the Godfather of soul move. Now that child was standing beside him. Michael had reached a level of fame that allowed people to describe him as though he had appeared without a source, as though the spins, pauses, vocal cries, and control of rhythm belonged to no tradition before him. But Michael refused that version of his own story. He named the man who had pointed him toward the stage. That humility made the moment stronger. Michael wasn't diminishing what he had created. He was acknowledging that originality doesn't require pretending. No one came before you. Brown had shown him how performance could live in the entire body, how a stop could be as powerful as a step, how the voice could strike like percussion, how one person could control the band, the crowd, and the silence between them. Michael had taken those lessons through Motown, solo records, music videos, and enormous concert stages. Yet standing beside Brown, he still spoke as a student. His voice tightened with emotion. Then he embraced the man he had once watched from home. For a few seconds, the titles disappeared. Not the Godfather of soul, not the King of pop, just the teacher and the artist who had never forgotten the lesson. But James Brown wasn't going to let the tribute remain one-sided. Michael had used the microphone to tell the world what Brown meant to him. Now Brown was about to take that recognition and turn it back toward Michael. James Brown didn't accept the award and quietly step away. The music started again. The cape settled across his shoulders. The band found the rhythm, and the ceremony turned back into a performance. Even after decades on stage, Brown still understood how to make a simple movement feel larger than the room around it. Michael stayed beside him. He didn't try to take control of the moment. He watched Brown's feet, followed the rhythm, and joined with the unmistakable happiness of someone standing inside a performance tradition he had admired since childhood. Then came the cape routine. For years, Brown had used that theatrical moment as part of his live shows. He would appear overcome, sink toward the stage, and allow a cape to be placed around his shoulders, only to throw it aside and return to the music with renewed force. At the BET Awards, Michael helped with that familiar ritual. The image carried more meaning than either man needed to explain. James Brown stood wrapped in one of the symbols of his own stage history. Michael, the artist who had carried Brown's influence into a different generation, was there helping the moment continue. It wasn't a contest. Michael didn't need to prove that he could move faster, spin longer, or draw the louder response. His attention remained on Brown. Every smile and gesture showed the respect of a student who understood that the spotlight belonged to the man being honored. Brown appeared equally pleased to have him there. For a few minutes, the stage held two generations of performance at once: the artist who had shown how rhythm could take over the entire body, and the artist who had carried that lesson into music videos, global tours, and a new visual age. Then Brown raised the microphone again. Michael had already told the audience what James Brown meant to him. Now Brown was about to answer with a word that made their connection feel far more personal. James Brown lifted the microphone and called Michael Jackson's name. Then came the words heard in the surviving footage. "For me, my son." They weren't a formal declaration. Brown wasn't describing a legal or family relationship. He was speaking with the affection of an elder artist toward someone who had spent a lifetime naming him as the source. That distinction matters because the line has often been expanded online into longer phrases that the available record doesn't clearly confirm. The shorter wording is powerful enough. Michael had already told the room that no performer had influenced him more. Brown answered by drawing Michael into his own musical family. 20 years earlier, that same voice had called Michael out of the audience at the Beverly Theater. Brown had opened his stage, handed the younger performer a microphone, and watched him move. Now the setting was different. Michael wasn't the unexpected guest anymore. He was one of the most successful entertainers in history, standing before the industry to honor the man who had first shown him what total stage command looked like. Yet Brown's words returned the moment to something deeply personal. The idol recognized the student, the teacher acknowledged what the lesson had become, and the influence Michael had carried publicly for decades was no longer traveling in only one direction. In 1983, Brown's microphone had given Michael a place on his stage. In 2003, it gave their connection a name, but the deepest confirmation came 3 years later, after James Brown's death, when Michael stood before a grieving audience and explained why his admiration had never faded. 3 years later, Michael stood before another audience to speak James Brown's name. This time, the stage was inside the James Brown Arena in Augusta, Georgia, during the public funeral service held on December 30th, 2006. Michael kept his remarks brief. He called Brown his greatest inspiration. Then he returned to the memory that had begun everything. He said he had been no more than 6 years old when his mother would wake him, no matter the time or what he was doing, whenever James Brown appeared on television. Michael remembered watching The Master at Work. He said Brown's movement mesmerized him because he had never seen another performer move that way. And in that childhood moment, Michael understood what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. The words mattered because they confirmed that the praise Michael had offered at the BET Awards wasn't ceremonial flattery. He had told the same story across different years, in different rooms, and under very different circumstances. The influence had begun before fame. It had survived Michael's rise through Motown, Thriller, music videos, stadium tours, and decades of being treated as an influence himself. Even after the student became an artist studied by millions, he still named James Brown as the man who first showed him what performance could be. The funeral wasn't where their story should end. It was simply the final public confirmation of something Michael had never hidden. James Brown had given him a direction. What Michael carried forward was how completely a performer could turn rhythm into movement, and movement into memory. 3 years later, Michael stood before another audience to speak James Brown's name. This time, the stage was inside the James Brown Arena in Augusta, Georgia, during the public funeral service held on December 30th, 2006. Michael kept his remarks brief. He called Brown his greatest inspiration. Then he returned to the memory that had begun everything. He said he had been no more than 6 years old when his mother would wake him, no matter the time or what he was doing, whenever James Brown appeared on television. Michael remembered watching The Master at Work. He said Brown's movement mesmerized him because he had never seen another performer move that way. And in that childhood moment, Michael understood what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. The words mattered because they confirmed that the praise Michael had offered at the BET Awards wasn't ceremonial flattery. He had told the same story across different years, in different rooms, and under very different circumstances. The influence had begun before fame. It had survived Michael's rise through Motown, Thriller, music videos, stadium tours, and decades of being treated as an influence himself. Even after the student became an artist studied by millions, he still named James Brown as the man who first showed him what performance could be. The funeral wasn't where their story should end. It was simply the final public confirmation of something Michael had never hidden. James Brown had given him a direction. What Michael carried forward was how completely a performer could turn rhythm into movement, and movement into memory. The microphone had carried their story across 2 decades. When Michael was a child, he heard James Brown through one, his voice cutting through the music, while his body seemed to command every beat around it. In 1983, Brown used a microphone to call Michael out of the Beverly Theater audience and onto his stage. For a few brief moments, the idol made room for the student. In 2003, Michael held one as he told the world that nobody had influenced him more. Then Brown took it back. He spoke Michael's name and called him his son. So the microphone was never merely part of the performance. It became the object that carried recognition in both directions, from the artist Michael had studied, and back from the artist who had watched what that influence became. The final image shouldn't be the funeral in Augusta. It should be the BET stage. James Brown stands beneath the lights, the silver cape resting across his shoulders. Michael is beside him in white and silver, smiling as the band keeps playing. Their shoulders nearly touch. Michael watches his idol move, still alert to every step. Brown looks pleased to have him there. For one more moment, the teacher and the student share the same rhythm, and neither man needs to explain what has passed between them. The microphone had carried their story across 2 decades. When Michael was a child, he heard James Brown through one, his voice cutting through the music, while his body seemed to command every beat around it. In 1983, Brown used a microphone to call Michael out of the Beverly Theater audience and onto his stage. For a few brief moments, the idol made room for the student. In 2003, Michael held one as he told the world that nobody had influenced him more. Then Brown took it back. He spoke Michael's name and called him his son. So the microphone was never merely part of the performance. It became the object that carried recognition in both directions, from the artist Michael had studied and back from the artist who had watched what that influence became. The final image shouldn't be the funeral in Augusta. It should be the BET stage. James Brown stands beneath the lights, the silver cape resting across his shoulders. Michael is beside him in white and silver, smiling as the band keeps playing. Their shoulders nearly touch. Michael watches his idol move, still alert to every step. Brown looks pleased to have him there. For one more moment, the teacher and the student share the same rhythm, and neither man needs to explain what has passed between them.